So we're going to go through the second annual message by President Andrew Jackson to see how well you can detect and identify fallacies in propaganda and use of rhetoric. So before you watch this, please go ahead and read through this yourself and mark anything that you see that you think is suspicious or, meets one of those kind of fallacies or pieces of propaganda that we have already read about. And that will help you see, are you really getting the ideas here and applying them and able to suss them out, as opposed to me just telling you what's there and then you're like, oh, okay, right? So it's always better try it yourself and then listen to me, all right? So President Andrew Jackson was first elected president in 1828. He was very famous as a general. Pretty much we give him credit for helping us win the War of 1812 because of the Battle of New Orleans, a very famous folk song called the Battle of New Orleans you might be aware of. Jackson hated Indians. When he was younger, I don't remember all the details off the top of my head, but when he was younger, he lived, in Tennessee, out in the country, and his family was caught up in the French and Indian War, and several of his relatives were killed in the fighting, right? He was made a prisoner of war, and when he was like 13, I think, and, it was a very, very dark time. And so he comes out of that not with the idea that war is hell, right? And that you don't have to be a certain ethnicity to create atrocities, but he really blamed Indians. And so when he took over as president, one of the primary focuses of his administration was to enact the Indian Removal Act. And this would take all of the tribes east of the Mississippi and move them west of the Mississippi. And at first, of course, Oklahoma was the primary place where they moved Indians, and then eventually they started moving them out into more of the southwestern parts of the country, Arizona and New Mexico. And so the second annual message is his first annual message. Actually, he kind of introduces the Indian Removal Act, but here it's almost a done deal, and he's really kind of just giving Congress an update of what's going on and why it will be beneficial. It's important to note that not everybody supported this, especially among the clergy. There was a big outcry about removing native tribes, but again, Jackson didn't care, and he was going to push it through, and he did. One of the more shameful aspects of American history, where we almost wiped out Native American tribes as a solution to the problem, right? So this is 1830. The act is enabled in 1830. The Cherokees fight in court until like the late 1830s, maybe 38, 39. Their first lawsuit is rejected by the Supreme Court. A second lawsuit comes in, and it is seen by the Supreme Court. Chief Justice Marshall is in favor of the Indian plea. He sides for them, but Jackson basically says, okay, yeah, you've made this, you've said they're right, but now how are you going to enforce it? And so because Jackson would not bring federal troops to bear to enforce it, there was nothing that happened, right? You have to realize that at this time, the only forces protecting Native American rights in this country were federal forces. And so states would try to take the land, they would abuse the Indians, they would run them off and all that. Local people, state militias and all that. And the federal government would have to come in and protect the Indians, right? And so once Jackson became president, though, that protection went away. And so it's really important to kind of understand those dynamics. So here he is, and he starts off, and if we can see here in this paragraph, and this is going to be a little bit long video, I'll try to break it up into like 10-minute sections, but we're really going to go through this so you can see all of the things that are going on here. So he says, it gives me pleasure to announce to Congress that the benevolent policy of the government, steadily pursued for nearly 30 years in relation to the removal of the Indians beyond the white settlements, is approaching to a happy consummation. So right in that first sentence, we see the use of virtue words, right? What we call glittering generalities. If we see here benevolent policy, so he's labeling the policy as something that is good, right? And here our consummation, so this is like, again, you're going to put it into practice, it's going to become a done deal. It is happy, right? So we see right off the bat him setting a tone and trying to slant the Indian Removal Act into a very positive look by using these words. So once you see an author do this once or twice, then you should actually really start paying attention to it and start marking everywhere else in the article that they use this kind of technique. Now remember, propaganda isn't necessarily bad. It's not good. It's neutral. It's how they're using it. So here, this is actually bad because it is not a benevolent policy. There is no happy consummation for the Indians here. And so he's totally misrepresenting it, right? So these are virtue words. Now remember, we also have labeling, which are the name calling, which are the negative ones. And we're going to see him use words like savages, like here, a few savage hunters. He uses savages like 4 times in here specifically to identify Native Americans. And so that is a labeling, right? You also might call that stereotyping, but it's definitely a type of labeling. So that is one technique, again, of identifying possible propaganda or fallacies or just use of rhetoric, is once you see it once, start paying attention and identify where it goes everywhere else, right? So he says 2 important tribes have accepted the provision made for the removal at the last session of Congress, and it is believed that their example will induce the remaining tribes also to seek out the same obvious advantages. So there's another way he's setting in that this is good, right? The 2 tribes that had accepted it basically had no choice. They had just given up. So they were not like, oh, yes, please, let's sign this and let's give away all of our land and get sent out into the wilderness, right? So again, he is presenting it as a very positive thing, but it's not. Right? And so that could again be, card stacking. It could be, anything where they're not giving us the whole truth, right? Or they're slanting it in a way that is the fallacy we're seeing here. So the consequences of a speedy removal will be important to the United States, to individual states, and to the Indians themselves. Okay, so here is his proposition. So we've got cause and effect. So once he starts setting cause and effect relationships, look for the cause and effect fallacy, right? What does he say is going to happen, and then what is the result of that thing, right? So here's the Indian Removal Act. If we pass it, when we pass it, well, all of these things will happen that are good for the federal government, the state government, and the Indians, right? Well, hindsight tells us that that is obviously untrue, but if you're listening to this as he is doing it, right, then you have to stop and say, okay, well, what is your proof that these effects will be positive, right? So then he goes in and he says pecuniary advantages. So if you did not look up pecuniary and you didn't know what it was, always look it up, right? So this is basically financial advantages. So think about, why is he talking about financial advantages to this group, right? Who is his audience? Well, his audience is U.S. Congress, right? But of course, this message would have been sent out, it would have been printed, or people would have reported on it, so other people would have heard it. So think about, why would people want to be assured that financially it's going to be a good thing, right? Well, there's greedy people, and there's people that want a strong economy. So he's trying to put into our minds that this is financially good. And he says, and it's the least of why it's good, right? So instead of saying, oh yeah, it's all about greed, he's like, no, this is the least benefit, is it's going to be financially solid for us, right? Then he gives us another reason why. It puts an end to all possible danger of collision between the authorities of the general and state governments on account of the Indians. So again, remember I was talking about how the federal government was the only one protecting them, and they'd come into clash with local governments. So here he's saying, yeah, if we did this, then we won't have any problem with, our own people coming to blows, over the Indians, right? And so again, this is an unfair assertion, because the problem is that local governments are not following the law. The Indians, this is their land, right? Many of them have gone into actual treaties with the U.S. to protect those lands, right? So it is our responsibility to protect the law and to do what we're saying, and we're not. And so he's like saying it's like the Indians are at fault because we're having an argument, like, as opposed to all of the white people who are cheating and, defying the law instead, right? So again, he sets up this idea that, oh, this will be great, but again, well, why are we having this problem, right? He says it will place a dense and civilized population in large tracts of country now occupied by a few savage hunters. So again, these are